Hello class, it's Dr. Miller and we are in week 7 of our 9-week class. We're in the final stretch here. And now that we've spent a week on each of the 5 books of the Pentateuch, you might be wondering what's left. Trust me, there's plenty more to go for the next 3 weeks. We're going to cover a lot of things in the coming 3 weeks. But particularly today, because it is the heart of the Pentateuch, and because it's the way that most of us think of the Jewish law, I want to spend today just talking about the 10 Commandments. And I'm going to go through them, and I want to look at each one and analyze it and talk about each one so we know the 10 Commandments really well. And if you really are committed to this, if you want to really grow not only in knowledge but in faith here, I'd recommend you memorize the 10 Commandments. It's good to be able to tick through them in your mind just so you know what the 10 are. We're going to go through those today, and that will constitute all of today's class. Hey, before we get into that, I want to share with you my God sighting of the week. A funny thing has been happening in the life of my church, Real Life Church. My staff has joked that since the very beginning, anytime we need anything, what we're doing is we're praying. We're praying that God provides it, and God does. But we joke that anytime we need anything, all we do is say it out loud, and it just shows up. I think I told you that very early on, there was a day where I went out for lunch with one of my board members in our very first weeks as a church, and he said, hey, we need a projector so that we can project song lyrics up on the wall. And that same afternoon, a woman texted me and said, God told me to give you my projector. And things like that have happened all through the life of our church over the last 5 years. Well, it happened again recently, and this is just funny. I think I told you that we're renting the building that I'm sitting in here in Covina, and we've just been given a building in Glendora. So we have 2 places in which we meet now and worship. And both of the buildings are from the 1950s. And both of them have older roofs on them, older roofs. And we've talked about how at some point, we're going to need to fix the roofs or maybe even replace the roofs when that time comes. And so it's been funny that for anything we need in the life of the church, there's almost always been someone in the church who knows how to do what we're looking for. So we have guys who've done construction and repairs their whole lives, and they volunteer and jump in. We needed a plumber, and it turned out a guy in our church used to be a plumber, and so he's been able to fix some little things around. We needed an electrician, and it turned out a guy in our church was an electrician. Well, 2-3 weeks ago, we said at one of our staff meetings, the only job we don't have in our church is a roofer. We don't have somebody who works on roofs, and we're going to need roofs before too long, so pray that God brings someone who works on roofs to our church. A week ago, a woman from the congregation emailed me and said, I just had the most wonderful conversation with a guy who came over to our house to give us an estimate to replace our roof. We're getting a new roof on, and he came and we talked for a long time, and the conversation turned towards matters of faith, and it turns out he believes in Jesus, and we invited him to church. And so this guy who is gonna help us with our roof is gonna be at church on Sunday. And he came to church on Sunday, and I met him, and he and I had coffee, and he loves Real Life Church as well. And so I told him, hey, the day may come where I call you because we need to hire you to do a roof or a couple of roofs on churches. And I just thought it was a funny way for God to respond that quickly. We said a couple weeks ago, hey, all we have to do is say it out loud and it just shows up. That's what God keeps doing. Let's ask God for a roofer. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, there was a roofer sitting right there in the chairs of our church. So that was my God sighting for the week. That was fun to see. And good news. So I wanted to just share that with you. All right, so today we are going to get into the 10 Commandments and just spend today doing that. All right, let's get into the 10 Commandments. The first thing we have to say about the 10 Commandments is not everyone agrees on how to count them. And that's because the Hebrew counting begins with the first statement of the 10 Commandments. The Catholic counting does something a little bit similar, and the Protestant counting says that the first statement is kind of an introduction, and what the Protestants call the first commandments, the Jewish people call the second commandment. So here's what I mean. Exodus chapter 20 at verse 1. God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Now, the Protestants count that as an introduction. That's God saying who he is. And the commandments begin with the next one. The Jewish people would say that is the first commandment. Either way, it's a very important beginning to the Ten Commandments, because it says the Ten Commandments come directly from God. They are an objective moral statement from the creator of the universe. They are not from Moses, and they're not from a matter of public opinion. This is what the being that designed us says we are made for. For instance, I had a friend in high school who built his own car. He built it from the ground up. Every single part in that car he installed himself. When we would drive around in his car, he could listen carefully and say, "Do you hear that noise?" And I would say, "No." And he would say, "I think there's something there. That noise wasn't there before." And he knew every tiny little sound in the car because every single part of the car was put there by him. In the same way, God made humanity. God made you and God made me. And when God says, I made you to do this and not to do that, he knows what we are made for. He designed every part of us. And so the Ten Commandments and God's law generally come from the designer as an owner's manual for the creation itself. So the Ten Commandments began, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And that's an important opening statement. These come from God. Secondly, what's also important about this commandment is that God identifies himself in a specific way. He doesn't say, I'm the Lord your God who created the universe. He doesn't say, I'm the Lord your God who's going to judge you in the end. He says, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of slavery. Here's who I am. Here's the defining movement in my relationship with you. I want you to be free. I didn't design you to be a slave. I want to liberate you, to set you free to the real life that I made for you. Don't be bound to sin and brokenness. Don't be bound to law and legalism. I am the God who rescued you out of slavery. That's who I am. I am a good God who provides for you when you cannot provide for yourself. This will be the foundation for God teaching Israel how to be a nation. Don't you go and enslave people. Don't you be an empire that oppresses people because you used to be oppressed by an empire. I am the God who has set you free. That's how the Ten Commandments begin. Now we get to what I'm going to call commandment number 1. You shall have no other gods before me. That is how the Ten Commandments begin. It is the first and most important commandment. I heard one rabbi say that if you truly lived out the first commandment, the other 9 all fall in line behind it. You just naturally do the other 9 if God is your only God. Now, in saying you shall have no other gods before me, there's sort of an interesting implication here. It means either there are actually other spiritual beings out there which contend for power, or it means that we make things into gods which we should not make into gods. And I would argue that both of those things are true. In the biblical worldview, God can create species like humanity, and human beings can choose to embrace God or reject God and run away. In the same way, God makes other species, like dogs. Dogs may not have the same moral capacity as human beings. Dogs may serve an entirely different purpose in God's creation, but God can create different species. The Bible says that God created another kind of species called angels, and that angels, like human beings, can choose to follow God or reject God. Those that reject God are called demons or unclean spirits. When you see Jesus walk around on the earth, he is often casting demons out of people. The demons speak to him and say they know who he is, and he silences them and throws them out. At one point, he drives them into a herd of pigs, and the herd of pigs runs off a cliff and dies. There's this sense that there are spiritual beings out there which have evil intentions. Likewise, when the Hebrew people traveled through the wilderness, they were surrounded by other nations which worshipped other gods. And the other gods required all kinds of things of their people. There was one ancient god in the Mesopotamian world named Chemosh. And Chemosh demanded things like child sacrifice from his adherents. Another god named Molech was a terrible god that required a child sacrifice and other things. And archaeologists have excavated remains of burial cemeteries that were dedicated to some of these gods, which contained the bones of animals that had been sacrificed and the bones of children. There were other gods of the nations around them. The modern post-Enlightenment view of this is that ancient religious people were just superstitious, and they believed all kinds of silly things. I think a more accurate worldview and a more biblical worldview is that there are competing spirits which try to retain the attention of human beings, and when we worship them, we empower them, and we give ourselves over to them. And that's really what the Bible teaches. The Bible is not a post-Enlightenment document that uses categories like superstition. It really talks about other spiritual beings, which in the Bible are often called gods. In English, we'll signify the fact that they are not the God of the Hebrew people by using a lowercase g. As you'll often see in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, you shall have no other gods, lowercase g, before me. But in the same way, secondly, there are things that we make into gods which are not gods at all. Sometimes we do this in relationships where we make another person or a spouse more important to us than God is. We can make money into a god. Though money is not a spiritual being itself, we can worship money and let money decide everything that we do in our lives and how we plan our future. Money can become something that we worship. Sometimes we make a god out of the thing we see in the mirror. We become narcissistic and we worship ourselves and our own lives. We assume that we're the center of the universe and everything should revolve around us. Well, all of that falls under the umbrella of the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. There's only one God, the God who created the universe, the God who will judge us in the end, the God who set his people free from slavery, and the God who walked the earth as Jesus of Nazareth. That is how the Ten Commandments began, with a little introduction that identifies God and the insistence that God's centrality and God's primacy are the most important of things. Now we come to the second commandment, which is very similar to the first one. The first one was, you shall have no other gods before me. The second one specifies, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Okay, there's a lot there. And commandment number 2. Don't make for yourself any images. Don't create idols. An idol is an image usually of a god, but it could be an image of a force of nature or an animal. This is actually a very common practice in the world today. This is not just a practice of the ancient world. If you go through a number of the countries in Southeast Asia, you'll find in houses people have created little altars, and on the altars, sometimes they'll place photos of ancestors who have died, who are prayed to in the afterlife, or offerings are made with the belief that it transfers to them in the afterlife. I know in Taiwan, parents will tell their children that after I die, you have to burn fake money. It's like Monopoly money, and that becomes money for me in the afterlife so that I can live well. Some nations in Africa still carve statues of animals and believe that a spirit lives in the statue, or that the spirit of the animal is somehow captured by the statue. And they believe that in worshiping the statue, the idol, somehow that transfers power to them or protects them. This has gone on throughout the history of the world in most cultures, but it still exists in the world today, as many Westerners don't realize that this is still a common practice. In Buddhist culture, it's not uncommon to carve statues of a Buddha and pray to them or around them. I remember being in Thailand and visiting a Buddhist temple, and there were gigantic 30 and 40 foot long statues of a a Buddha lying down with its eyes closed, and people would go and make offerings and pray to the Buddha through the idol. The Bible unilaterally condemns the worship of idols. If you grew up in a culture or a home where idols were worshipped, and you decide to follow Jesus, that brings an end to idol worship. You can't do both. And this is where that comes from. God says, don't create images. Don't create things that you worship in the name of any power other than me. And it says, because I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. And some people get stuck on this and say, wait a minute, if God is powerful and good, how could he be jealous? Jealousy seems like a petty emotion. How could God be petty? That sounds like the ancient Greek gods, Zeus and Hermes and Aphrodite, who were always fighting with each other because they were jealous and petty. This is a different kind of jealousy. This is a God who has a passionate love for his children. And he wants to be reconciled to his children. He wants his lost children to come home. And his heart beats fast for lost children. What God is saying is, I have a passionate love for you, and I don't want you turning astray and worshiping anything else. I want you seeking a relationship with me. You might say it's petty until you think of God like a parent. And think of a parent who has a child who ignores the parent and goes running off to be with their friends and tells the parent, I don't want to see you anymore. That parent becomes jealous, not because the parent is petty, but because the parent's love is deep. And that's how God is identified in the second commandment. I am a passionate God. I love you that much. And then people get caught up in the teaching that I punish to the third and fourth generation those who hate me. Why do the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren deserve anything because of something a great-grandparent did? Well, here I think what the scriptures are saying is actually just common sense. And it's sort of practical wisdom. If a parent is an alcoholic, the children suffer the fallout of an alcoholic parent. If parents divorce, children suffer the pain that they go through because of the parents' divorce, and it marks them. They carry that pain and that memory throughout the course of their life. And then that changes the way they parent. They sometimes react and overreact to the way they were parented. A very strict parent can create a very loose child who rebels against strictness, which they then pass to the next generation. And the next generation has to figure out the consequences of that parenting. All the more so in the ancient world, where the average lifespan might have been 40 years. And so you had children very young, and you raised your children near your parents, so the family unit traveled together. And so the influence of the generation was wed together like that. I think saying I punish to the third and fourth generation is simply the practical results of the way parenting works. Showing love to thousands of generations who love me and keep my commandments is part of the lavish promise of God. And you see that in God's covenants. God promises to Noah, I'll never flood the earth again. God promises to Moses, if you keep my laws for 1,000 years, I will be your God. He promises to David, there'll always be someone in your bloodline who is the king. And so there is a sense that God's promises last through thousands of generations. That's the second commandment. The third commandment, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. This seems, again, to the modern listener, this can seem kind of petty. Why would God care if I misuse his name? You hear people all the time use God's name when they're cursing. And why would God care about that? Why does that matter? Isn't it just kind of disrespectful, but maybe not that important? Two things here. One, I think God's desire to be respected is actually more important than anything else in the world. And our respect for God is so important that it ought to cover over every word we say. And so when we casually use God's name, it signifies an apathy about who God is. And I think that is actually very important. I think God actually wants us to be so attentive to him that the use of his name stands out in our minds and never becomes something casual. And secondly, I think spiritually there is a real power to the use of names. If a parent calls you stupid, or someone you like calls you ugly, that hangs on you. You can't easily walk away from that. And conversely, when someone you respect compliments you, or when someone who you admire praises you, you carry that with you. And so the naming of a thing, the branding of a thing, actually has spiritual power in it. And in our post-Enlightenment materialistic world, we may think such things are superstition. I think that's because we're shallow. I think the post-Enlightenment world has made us out of touch with the power of language and the power of emotion, and we've become very shallow about the things of the Spirit. I think the naming of things actually does have a true power in it, and so that's why God says, commandment number 3, don't misuse the name of the Lord. The 4th commandment is this: remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So the Jewish creation story involves a God who creates the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day God rests. It's sort of hard to imagine that an omnipotent being needs to rest, but it sets the model for what God wanted from his creation. 1 day a week is to be a day of rest and worship, and not a day of work. The word Sabbath is the Hebrew word Shabbat, and it means the day of rest, and it also means seventh. It is the 7th day of the week, the resting day. And for the Jewish people, the Sabbath is what we would call Saturday. It was actually after Jesus rose from the dead that the Christians moved their Sabbath day to Sunday and began celebrating it on Sunday. The Sabbath day is an interesting one because it's the first positive of the 10 commandments. It's the first one that says do this as opposed to don't do that. And it's unique in that remembering the Sabbath day is right up there with don't murder and don't commit adultery and don't steal. And it actually precedes them. The idea that we would have a day of rest and worship is that important, which for modern Americans is a curiosity. Most Americans have an overdeveloped sense of weekend and an underdeveloped sense of Sabbath. We believe in taking time off to go play, but our play involves activities and running around or vegetating in front of the TV and doing things that are mindless. It's nothing really rejuvenating. It's nothing certainly worshipful. A weekend and a Sabbath are not the same thing. A Sabbath day is a day that's dedicated to God. And one of the best sustained reflections I've ever read on the Sabbath was from a Jewish rabbi named Abraham Heschel, who wrote a tiny little book called The Sabbath. It's about 100 pages long, and it is a brilliant read. In it, Heschel says that the Sabbath day is essentially designed to be a day in which we return to Eden. We return to life the way it was created to be lived, a life at peace, a life in which we don't have to work. We are in an uninterrupted relationship with the Creator, and we spend a day doing nothing but savoring that. It is not a day that's designed to make us work harder on the other days. It's not a break so that we can go back to work. In fact, Heschel says, if the Sabbath were in a conversation with the other 6 days of the week, you can imagine personifying this and animating this, the other 6 days of the week could say to the Sabbath, you're lazy. You never do anything. You just sit around all the time. And the Sabbath could respond to the other 6 days of the week. Actually, no, this is as it's supposed to be. You all are made for me. I am not made for you. The Sabbath day is not designed so that we can work on the other 6 days. The 6 days of work are designed to provide for us sufficiently that on the Sabbath day we can rest. This is a contrast to the way some people have thought about the Sabbath. In the first century world, a Jewish philosopher named Philo defended the Sabbath day to the Romans. The Romans did call the Jewish people lazy for taking a day off every week. And Philo defended the Sabbath by saying, if you'll allow us to take 1 day of rest, we'll work so much harder on the other 6 days, it will be worth it. And while that is a clever Roman argument, it is not the purpose of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is meant to be a day in which we reorient ourselves towards God and towards life as it is supposed to be. It's sort of like back in the old days, we had a little compass that we would use when we went hiking in the woods, and it would tell us which direction is north so that we wouldn't get lost. These have all been replaced with digital technologies today, but back in the day, it was a little metal rod floating in a liquid, and it was magnetized to point towards due north. But a compass could actually get disoriented. It could get misdirected so that it no longer pointed towards north. And the way to correct the compass was to take a magnet and hold it from the northern direction towards the compass, and the compass would reset itself. It would direct itself back to north. Well, that's what the Sabbath day is meant to be. It's a recalibration. It's a turning back towards our true north, towards our Creator, and towards our creation as it is supposed to be. That's what the Sabbath day is meant to be. And that's why it makes it into the Ten Commandments. That's why it's so important. If we are not reorienting ourselves towards God, we will lose track of who God is and who we are. Again, another well, you know what? I'll save some of that for next week. I want to spend a good deal of time talking about the Sabbath. But that's what the Sabbath is. The Sabbath is a day set apart for rest. One other final interesting note in the keeping of the Sabbath. You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath day, but neither is your male or female servant. The people who work for you are not allowed to work on the Sabbath day either. So you can't take a day off and then slough off all your responsibilities on other people so they still get done. Everybody is to have a Sabbath day. And in the history of America, there was a long season in which all businesses were closed on Sunday. Today, we're stunned that Chick-fil-A isn't open on Sundays because they're a Christian company and believe in taking a Sabbath day, but it wasn't that long ago in American history, and it was true through most of American history. All businesses were closed on Sunday. Sunday was the day in which you went to church, and that was it. So that was an interesting one. You're not allowed to have people who work for you work on the Sabbath day either, nor the foreigner residing in your towns. Because deep in the Jewish mindset was that when you took someone into your nation, when a foreigner lived among you, you were to treat them as one of your own and take them in as one of your own. And the freedom of the Sabbath was to apply to them also. In that way, Sabbath is really an act of social justice. It's an act of saying, I am not what I do. I am what God made me to be. The Sabbath rekindles the reality that my identity is not shaped by working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. My identity is shaped by the God who made me, and work must be secondary and subservient to Sabbath. So that's the fourth commandment. Now you notice the first four commandments all have to do with our relationship with God. There is one God, no idols, honor God's name, keep the Sabbath day to worship God. The next six commandments all have to do with our relationship with other human beings. And so there's what's called a vertical component of the Ten Commandments and a horizontal component of the Ten Commandments. The first four were all about our relationship with God, and those come first. And then we get into our relationship with human beings. So now we're into the commandments that have to do with our relationships with one another. And the first of those, which is commandment number 5, is actually fascinating. It's interesting where it starts. It starts out, honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Of all the commandments that involve our relationships with one another, before do not murder, before do not commit adultery, before do not steal, the first one is honor your father and mother. And that's fascinating. That might be in part because of the psychological reality that the family unit is central to the existence of humanity. Right? A mom and a dad making babies is the center of structure of all human existence. And if that relationship gets broken, if the children rebel against the parents, that actually breaks the central structure that humanity is designed to function within. And so honoring your father and mother psychologically, having a healthy relationship with father and mother, it shapes everything else. And so you can see pragmatically why that would be the case. There's also a spiritual sense in which honoring your father and mother is a spiritual manifestation. The biology is a manifestation of the spiritual reality. So, in other words, we are children of God. We are made by our Creator. And the fundamental relationship that needs to be restored in creation is our relationship with God. And in that sense, we need to learn to live in God's house and to obey God. And so the fact that God has designed us biologically to give birth to new human beings who have to grow up depending on us, it becomes a biological manifestation of the spiritual reality that we are creations that depend on the Creator. God has made all kinds of different animals. There are animals that reproduce by themselves. Aphids reproduce without another aphid. They just pop new aphids into existence. And God could have made us that way. But God made us to exist in a family unit in which we have to be raised and we have to learn and grow and be dependent on parents. And so I think God's biological design is there to teach us the spiritual reality. So that's why it's so important that we honor our father and mother, and that's at the heart of these commandments. It doesn't say blindly obey your father and mother, and that's an important reality. Teenagers usually become aware of how this commandment works when they look at it seriously. Blindly obeying a parent who teaches you to do things that are immoral or unhealthy is not actually honoring the parent. Honoring the parent means doing what's best for the parent, and in some cases that can mean saying no. In the cases of an abusive family, that can require the child to be separated from the family or to report the family, because obeying an abusive parent is not honoring the parent. It is allowing the parent to remain in dysfunction. Finally, the other interesting thing to note about this commandment is that there's a direct consequence of it. If you honor your father and mother, you will live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. There's a tie between their inheritance, which is what they want more than anything else. The Jewish people want land, and there's a tie to healthy family structures and their existence in the land. That's the second commandment that has a positive statement. It's not a do not, it's a do, and the rest of them are all do nots. Here we go. That's number 5. Number 6, you shall not murder. Now, there's been a lot of debate over how that word murder should be translated. Because in some traditional translations of the Bible, the commandment read, you shall not kill. But that raises the question of warfare. What happens when you have an evil dictator who's committing genocide and just eliminating millions of people at a whim? Doesn't there get to be some point where the only ethical thing to do is to fight back against that dictator, even if it means violence, even if it means killing the dictator? And Christians throughout history have said there is some basis for a just war, for fighting when it is the only thing left to do, and it has to be the right thing to do, because allowing evil to conquer and be destructive is so horrible. And of course, one of the classic examples of this is that during World War II, a German theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer took part in an assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler. It failed, and Bonhoeffer ended up dying in one of the concentration camps. But Bonhoeffer, who wrote a book on ethics, came to the point where he believed that assassinating Hitler was the most morally correct thing that he could do. And that's why you'll see this verse translated, you shall not murder. Because ethicists and theologians believe that there are some situations in which the taking of a life is the better option of the multiple options. I'll leave that in the hands of you to contemplate that ethically, but that's why the commandment reads, you shall not murder, as opposed to you shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. Adultery is when a married person cheats on their husband or wife, cheats on their spouse with someone they're not married to. And in that case, both the married person and the person with whom they have a relationship are said to be adulterers in the Bible. And again, because the family unit is that central structure around which society is built, the Bible preserves and upholds that family unit and says, don't break that unit. Don't cheat on your spouse. It is interesting that in the Bible, the most common marital structure was actually polygamy. In the Bible, from the very beginning, husbands had many wives and often concubines by which to have multiple children because children were a matter of survival. It's only in the New Testament where you see hints of the beginning of monogamy. And in the Greco-Roman culture, monogamy had become increasingly the norm. So you would see the letters that Paul writes to Timothy saying an elder in the church should be a husband of only one wife. And that implies that there were polygamous situations that they knew about, and the Christian church was inclining in the direction of monogamy. And so that is the, what are we on now? 5, 6, 7. That is the 7th commandment. Number 8, you shall not steal. And it's a simple enough commandment, but psychologists will tell you that all human beings at one point or another have stolen something from someone else. In fact, there are psychological tests which include the question, have you ever stolen anything? And if you answer no, the test report comes up that you're most likely lying, because they begin with the default assumption that everyone has stolen something at some point. It is just in our nature. I have a friend who used to work with children, and he said, all children are thieves and liars. At a young age, we all learn to lie because we're embarrassed and we want to cover our tracks, and we all learn to take things that aren't ours because we want them. So it's deep in the nature of humanity, and deep in the 10 Commandments is the command, don't steal. Number 9, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. Don't lie about people. Right? False testimony doesn't necessarily mean testimony in a court. It just means don't lie. Don't make up stories about people. Tell the truth about people. And number 10, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Covet is a fancy religious word for to be jealous of, to desire something that belongs to someone else. I once read a rabbi who said that if you obey the first 9 commandments, the 10th commandment is irrelevant. Because if you live the first 9, you will be so satisfied with your life, you will have no need to covet anyone else's life. Your life will be perfectly good as it is, and you won't desire anyone else's life. And so those are the 10 commandments. That's a brief outline of the 10 commandments, and that gives us groundwork to talk about ethics. So that is the 10 Commandments. And as I said, it's worthwhile memorizing them, at least in outline form, so that you can name what each of the 10 Commandments are. They've had a profound influence on the history of the world. In fact, even today, the United States Supreme Court building has a carving of the 10 Commandments on the outside of it, because just objectively, the history of Western culture, at the very least, now the rest of the world, has been shaped and influenced by the 10 Commandments. They still have a profound effect on people today, even psychologically. In fact, an experiment was done in which a number of students were taking a classroom test, and they separated out a certain group of those students, and before they took the test, they read to them the 10 Commandments. They just read the 10 Commandments to them, and then they went and took their school test. Afterwards, they did an anonymous survey, and they asked all the students who took the test, did you cheat? And they could answer the survey truthfully because it was anonymous. And the students who had heard the 10 Commandments read before they took the test reported far less incidences of cheating than students who just took the test on their own. There's just sort of a psychological sense that when you know there's a God out there who grounds morality and has expectations for us, it tends to shape the way we behave. Don't forget that in the Christian worldview, the law of Moses is no longer that thing which determines where we stand with God. According to the law of Moses, according to the 10 Commandments, we've all failed. If you read the book of Romans, chapters 1 through 3, you can see the bottom line for Christian ethics is that we are all sinners. We have all fallen short of what God wanted for us. In fact, it's even worse than that. It says, no one has done good, not one of us. Jesus even says at one point, if you who are evil can give good gifts to your children, imagine how much good God can give to you. So his default assumption is that you are evil. And if we're evil, then we can never, through the law, make ourselves good enough to satisfy a perfect God. This is important because some people have in mind that they don't care that much about God and they don't want to find out that much about it. And if, after they die, they find themselves looking face to face with God, they'll just appeal to God and say, look, I was a pretty good person. Shouldn't I be forgiven? Shouldn't I be allowed into heaven because I was a pretty good person? It's important to pay attention to Christian doctrine on this one. No one is good enough. No one can earn their salvation through good works. The works of the law don't do anything but show us how bad we are. And if you argue and say, no, I'm not that bad, don't forget, a lot of who you are is determined by your geography. It's determined by where you were born, what's in your genetic makeup, what parents you have. A lot of it is not things that you came to through moral decision making. It's things that were given to you. And if you had grown up in a different context with a different family and different genetic inclinations, you might have done much worse things than you've done so far. A lot of our moral behavior is simply socialization. We've been taught and restrained towards good behavior. But if set free, most of us are just one plane crash away from Lord of the Flies. So don't assume that because you've behaved well, you're going to stand in front of God in the end and say, hey, wasn't I good enough? The answer is unquestionably no. No, you weren't good enough. None of us have been. We are not saved by obeying the law. Instead, we're saved when we believe that Jesus was God who walked the earth and that Jesus died on the cross to pay for our sins. So all that bad stuff I've done gets its punishment on the cross. And I'm forgiven because the punishment has already been paid for it. There's nothing left for me to pay for because Jesus took the punishment for me. And when I believe in him, I am forgiven. That's where salvation comes from. That's how we are justified before God. Not by being good, but by believing in Jesus. The law then becomes a role model for how a good life should be lived. I'm not earning anything from God by following it. I'm just doing my best to live according to my design, to live according to the way God made me to be. And so I try very hard not to kill or steal or to covet my neighbor's mule, right? I try to obey the Ten Commandments because it makes for a good life. It's how we're designed. And that's why you get those promises built into the Ten Commandments that say if you do these things, you'll be blessed for many generations. If you do these things, you'll live at peace in the land. And that's simply pragmatically, if we live according to those commandments, we will live closer to how we are designed to live. Now, let me draw attention to one kind of fascinating fact about Moses receiving the Ten Commandments up on the top of Mount Sinai. Remember, Moses is wandering through the wilderness with all God's people. He says, you guys stay down here. I'm going to go up on the mountain and talk to God. And he's gone for 40 days and 40 nights. He goes up on the mountain and God gives him the tablets on which the Ten Commandments are written. And the Jewish people forever after will remember that as one of the great moments in their history. In fact, they'll have a holiday dedicated to remembering the fact that God gave the Ten Commandments to Moses. And that holiday is called Pentecost. And it became a great harvest festival where they'd celebrate the harvest and they'd remember that God gave Moses the law. And this was a way of saying we know who God is because God has spoken. God has revealed himself. And God revealed himself as one who sets us free from slavery in Egypt and then gives us the law to live by. This is our constitution. This is our guidebook for life and for being a nation. And so we will have a holiday every year in which we remember who we are. It's a little bit like the 4th of July, although the Jewish festival, the Passover, is closer to the 4th of July. But nonetheless, it was a a holiday of remembering their national identity. They are a people founded on the law of God, and that was Pentecost. So for 1,000 years, for 1,500 years before Jesus, they celebrated Pentecost every single year. Well, something interesting happens in the New Testament. The New Testament begins with the stories of Jesus' life in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the Gospels. Those tell the story of who Jesus was. At the end of those stories, Jesus is crucified and rises from the dead. The fifth book of the New Testament is called Acts. And Acts is also written by Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke. Originally, Luke and Acts were one long book that was put together. And Acts tells the stories of the early Christians. It's Luke's perspective on what happened after Jesus ascended up into heaven and the disciples began to scatter around the Mediterranean and start churches and tell people about Jesus. And a fascinating thing happens. As the disciples are gathered in Jerusalem and they're praying, there's a moment in Acts chapter 2 where something extraordinary happens. God's Spirit pours down from heaven into the disciples, and it says it looks like tongues of fire coming down on them. And all of a sudden, the disciples of Jesus, who were from Galilee, began to speak in all kinds of different languages. Languages they had never known before, languages that they had not learned. All of a sudden, they could speak in all of these different languages and tell people gathered in Jerusalem about the story of Jesus. In fact, you can read the story. There's actually a funny joke in there. The people gathered around who hear all these Galileans babbling in these different languages say, maybe they're just drunk. And Peter, the apostle, replies, it's only 9 a.m. We're not drunk yet. Nobody's drunk at 9 a.m. But that is the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. Now, this is important. God chose the holiday in which his people remembered that he spoke to pour out the Holy Spirit. In the Hebrew Scriptures, God speaks through the law, and that becomes the celebration of Pentecost. In the New Testament, in the book of Acts, God speaks through the Spirit, and that becomes the foundation of the Christian church. God speaks through the law, and then God speaks through the Spirit. And when you read the New Testament, the Apostle Paul is at pains to make sure we understand we are not bound by the law anymore. We're led by the Spirit. And the Spirit sets us free where the law only enslaved us. The law gave us rules that we could not follow and that made us stand condemned. And it's actually the Spirit that sets us free. Lastly, just a couple words on ethics. The laws of the ancient world were the groundings of ancient ethical systems. In the modern world, there's been an attempt to create alternative ethical systems based on something other than a law distributed from a divine being, dictated by a divine being. In the world of ethics, obedience to a law or a principle is called deontology. And the ancient law systems were all deontological because a divine being or a king would say, here's what the laws are. And when the kings did it, they usually claimed that it came from a god. That was just the nature of the early systems of law. In the Enlightenment period and thereafter, there arose an attempt to say, perhaps we can create an ethical system based on something other than divine revelation, using reason as a foundation for ethics. Perhaps we can say there are certain pragmatic approaches to ethical decision making that everybody can and should agree on, and those can become the foundation of our ethics. So there arose a kind of ethical thinking called contract theory, wherein I say I promised to allow you a certain amount of freedom and not steal from you, if in return you allow me the same degree of freedom and promise not to steal from me. And we shake hands and we contract that that's what our system is going to be made on, and thus you have a legal ethical system. Now the problem is, of course, if I can get away with cheating or stealing, I might just want to do it anyway, even though I've agreed to. So then you have to come up with a governmental executive branch, a process by which people can be punished for breaking the laws. And that becomes part of our contract is I promise not to steal from you, you promise not to steal from me, and we empower this other person to punish whoever goes around stealing. And that works pretty well. We come up with a pretty merry system of creating laws that govern our behaviors. The problem is there are a couple of problems. One, you never achieve any kind of ethical objectivity in that system. If a majority of people decide that there's a minority group of people who are second-class citizens, who don't deserve the same rights as the majority, there's nothing to stop the majority from overruling the minority and enforcing oppressive rules on them. That, of course, is the history of the United States of America. We enslaved and segregated for hundreds of years, all while calling ourselves Christians and saying that we were enforcing ethical laws. We were enforcing very evil laws and in our minds rationalizing that somehow they were ethically correct. India today still functions with a caste system in which people are believe that they are born into the status in life that they have, either a high class or a low class, and they're condemned to stay there. And if the higher class wants to manipulate or misuse the lower class, they actually can often do that with the blessing of the laws of the state, because there's no ethical system which objectively guarantees the dignity of the individual. And so contract theory never achieves what the Ten Commandments should have done or were designed to do, which is to give objective laws which say in all cases these apply. You cannot give yourself an exemption based on class. You can't just apply these rules to some people and not others. These are the laws from the designer for all of creation. Everyone is to follow them. And so the law, as dictated by God, enjoys a special status or privilege that contractual agreements among human beings can never establish. And so that's an important ethical reality. We will never establish an ethical system that achieves objectivity without a creator who has a moral inclination. And that's an important part of where the Ten Commandments and religious law generally grounds ethical thinking. Good things to consider. Let me make sure I include a vocabulary list for the week. I think I might have left it out last week, but we'll get one in this week. And I've got 9 words for you today that are just good for you to have under your belt as we study the Bible together. I would have to start with number 1 today, commandment. A commandment is a directive from a person in authority telling the follower or believer or adherent what to do. And the expectation is that a commandment is to be followed under penalty of punishment if it is not followed. Number 2, Pentecost. Pentecost is the holiday that the Jewish people celebrated in order to remember that they were set free from slavery. No, that's wrong. I'm confusing it with Passover. Pentecost is the holiday that the Jewish people celebrated in order to remember the fact that God gave the law, the Ten Commandments, to Moses on the top of Mount Sinai. And so Pentecost was the remembrance of the giving of the law, of God speaking through the law. In the New Testament, in the Christian church, as recorded in the book of Acts in the Bible, Pentecost became the day in which God released his Holy Spirit on the disciples. And so God spoke through the law on Pentecost in the Hebrew Scriptures, and God spoke through the Spirit on Pentecost in the Christian Scriptures. So there's an intentional and important parallel there in God speaking. That's Pentecost. Number 3, an idol. An idol is usually a statue or a constructed image of either God or some sort of being of power, which is then worshipped. Sometimes idols are shaped like animals, and people will worship the spirit that they believe is contained within an animal. The Hebrew and Christian scriptures condemn the worship of idols. They say, don't ever make idols, don't worship idols. The worship of idols is called idolatry, and idolatry is condemned by the Jewish and Christian scriptures. Number 4, Sabbath. Sabbath is the day of rest. In the creation narrative, God creates the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day, God rests. And that becomes a model for all of his followers to then spend 6 days working and rest on the 7th day. This is, of course, the 4th commandment of the 10 commandments. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. On it you shall not do any work, nor should anyone who works for you do any work. The Sabbath day is a day of rest. It comes from the Hebrew Shabbat, which means seventh or the day of rest. And for the Jewish people, the Sabbath was Saturday. The Christians moved it to Sunday to signify that it was the day remembering Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Jesus is crucified on Friday. On the Sabbath day, everything is silent, and then he rises on Sunday, which would have been their first day of the week, and first day of their work week, and it became the day of rest for Christians thereafter, Sabbath. Number 5 is the word covet. And covet means to be jealous of and desire something that's not yours, something that belongs to somebody else. I never hear the word used anywhere in the English language except when it refers to religion and specifically to the 10th commandment. The 10th commandment is don't covet your neighbor's belongings. Anything that belongs to them, your neighbor's wife or their goods or their farm or anything. Don't covet your neighbor's belongings. But I really never hear the word covet in any other context in the English language today. We could obviously use the word for any kind of jealousy. It just has a particularly religious sound to it. Number 6, rabbi. Rabbi is the Hebrew word for teacher, and a very specific kind of teacher. A rabbi was the most exalted position in the Hebrew life in the day of Jesus. If one became a rabbi, one was seen as a theologian. You knew about God. You were seen as a lawyer because you took God's law and interpreted it and told people what it meant. You were also the judge because the rabbis, or a gathering of rabbis called the Sanhedrin, could interpret the law and say, here's how it applies in this legal case or that legal case. And so they were the most respected and feared among the Jewish people. They were the authorities in all things. Number 7, blessing. Blessing is a term that we toss around loosely in modern American English. A blessing was said to be a gift that was from God, and it was unexpected and often undeserved. You could earn blessings through good behavior in the Hebrew mindset, but often God would bless people who did not deserve it because God is a generous God. And blessings were used for all sorts of things, from financial goods to a positive change in the weather so that a farmer got rain, to a description of relationships in which people are good to one another. You could say someone is a blessing to me. Number 8, omnipotent. Omni is a Greek prefix that means all, and potent means powerful, and so omnipotent is all powerful. And God is said to be omnipotent. God has all power. And number 9, omniscient. Omni is all, and shint or scient is the same word as you hear in conscience, and it has to do with thinking or thought. And so omniscient is all-knowing. God is said to be all-knowing. He knows everything. Nothing can be kept secret from him. So those are our 9 vocabulary words for the week. Make sure you learn those and know those. If you're in my university class, some of those will be on the final exam. And they're all good to know just as you go about life and speak English. There you go.
You're most likely familiar with the 10 Commandments in the Bible, stuff we generally take as good advice. Don't murder, don't steal, honor your parents, the list goes on.
And those are just the first 10. There are actually a total of 613 commands, all given to ancient Israel, found in the first 5 books of the Bible, which in Hebrew are called the Torah.
Now, the word Torah is usually translated in English as the law, because it has all of these laws in it. And as you read through them, you wonder, am I supposed to obey some of these, all of these? I mean, what's the purpose of the law.
Well, that translation is kind of confusing because while the Torah has laws in it, the book itself is fundamentally a story about how God is creating new kinds of people who are fully able to love God and love others. And when Jesus taught about the Torah, he said that he was bringing that story to its fulfillment.
So walk me through the story and how it's fulfilled.
So the story begins with God creating humanity who rebels. And God chooses Abraham to bless all of the nations through his family, who end up in slavery down in Egypt, and so God rescues them. Then at Mount Sinai, God makes a covenant with Israel, like an agreement. And all of the laws that Moses gives to Israel are the terms of that agreement. They're like a constitution. And so some of the laws, they're about rituals and customs that set Israel apart from the nations. Other laws are about social justice or morality. And by following these, Israel would show the other nations what God is like.
Okay, so the rest of the Torah is just the complete list of laws that Moses gives Israel?
No, the rest of the Torah just continues the story. And the 613 commands are only a selection from that original constitution. And even these have been broken up and placed at strategic points within the story. Now pay attention, because you'll see a really clear pattern. Moses gives the first laws to Israel.
Yeah, don't worship other gods, don't make idols.
And then right after that, there's a story of Israel breaking those very laws.
Yeah, they worship the golden calf.
And so Moses gives some more laws, and then you get more stories of rebellion. Some more laws, rebellion again, some more laws, more rebellion, and you start to see the point.
Right, no matter how many laws, they're just gonna continue to rebel.
So at the conclusion of the Torah's story, Moses gives this final speech to Israel as they prepare to go into their new home. And he tells them, you guys, I know that you're not going to follow all of God's laws. You've proven to me that you're incapable. And Moses says the problem is that their hearts are hard and that they're going to need new, transformed hearts if they're ever going to truly follow God's law. And he was right. I mean, the story goes on to recount Israel's total failure.
They go into the land, they break all the laws.
Right. Now, the next section of books in the Jewish tradition are the 15 books of the prophets, and they reflect back on the story. For example, Ezekiel, he said that if Israel was ever going to obey the law, God's Spirit would have to transform their hard hearts into soft hearts. And Jeremiah said that's when obedience to God's commands wouldn't feel like a duty, but they would be written deep in their hearts. And Isaiah, he promised a future leader, Israel's Messiah, who will lead all of the people in obedience to the law. Now, in Jewish tradition, all of these books together are called the prophets, even the historical books, because they're continuing the story told from the perspective of the prophets.
Okay, so we have the law and the prophets, and they're telling one connected story about God's desire to bless the whole world through a people, Israel, who it turns out needs a new heart.
Yes, and Jesus saw himself as continuing that story. So he agreed with the law and the prophets when he taught that it's out of the human heart that come the most ugly parts of human nature. It's like the default setting of our hearts is opposed to God's law. But Jesus also said that he came to solve that problem, and in his words, to fulfill the law.
So what does he mean there, to fulfill the law?
Well, first he said that the demand of all of the laws in the Torah could be fulfilled by what he called the Great Command, that we are to love God and to love others.
So that seems pretty easy. I mean, we all want to love.
Well, we think we want to love. But Jesus showed how love is far more demanding than we realize. So he quotes the law, do not murder. And he says, yes, not killing someone is a very loving thing to do. But then he also says that when you treat someone with disrespect or when you nurse resentment against them, you're also violating God's moral ideal because you're not treating that person with love. And so Jesus said true love ought to extend even to our own enemies. So even though this command seems very simple, Jesus showed how our hearts are not currently equipped to fulfill even this basic command of God to love others.
And that's kind of a downer.
But where Israel failed, Jesus brought this story to its fulfillment. As Israel's Messiah, he fully loved God and others, and he showed all of the nations what God is truly like. He did this through his acts of compassion and mercy, and ultimately by loving his enemies even unto death. And after his resurrection, he told his followers that he would send God's Spirit to transform their hearts so that they could follow him and fulfill the purpose of the law, to love God and to love their neighbor. So this fulfills the story of the law and the prophets, or in the words of the Apostle Paul, the one who loves fulfills the law.